Okay, welcome to Psych 235 Child Psychology. We're talking about middle childhood cognitive development this week, and today we're going to have our second lecture on cognitive development, finishing up this chapter. So let's get started. First thing we're going to talk about is information processing. Okay, remember the cognitive development chapter is about learning, it's about memory, it's about how we think, that kind of stuff. So we're talking about information processing. So information processing is affected by several things: your knowledge base, your control processes, your speed of processing, and executive function. First, let's talk about the knowledge base. Okay, knowledge base is just basically how much information you know. Okay, an extensive knowledge base is actually makes it easier to master new related information. It helps memory. Okay, it's influenced by experience, of course. The more experiences you have, more places you go, the more times you go to school, the more information you're exposed to, the more your knowledge base grows. Opportunities as well, right? You have the opportunity to go to school. If you have the opportunity to travel, that's also good, right? Opportunity to do all sorts of things. We learn from everything, okay, including play, traveling, school, our interactions with others. So those opportunities matter. And personal motivation as well. That's something important that often gets left out. But if you want to learn about something, it's easier to learn about it, right? If you care about it. There might be some children, for instance, who like animals a lot. And they really have a lot of motivation, to see and learn about animals. So the more they're exposed to animals and they're taking trips at the zoo or the farm or whatever it is, the easier it is for them to grow their knowledge base. They learn a lot about animals. Even those children that might be on the autism scale, right, on the spectrum, for some of them, it's animals. That's what they're fascinated with. And they can learn a lot about that. So motivation matters a lot. Right? If you care about things that have to do with science, it's easier to learn about science, right? If you care about things that have to do with math, and you learn a lot about that. But the knowledge base is important. It makes it easier to master new related information, and it makes it easier to remember things. The greater the knowledge base, the bigger it is, the easier it is to learn. Knowledge just accumulates and it kind of snowballs. Information processing is also affected by your control processes. And with these control processes, we mean neurological mechanisms. We mean things in the brain, right? The brain likes to organize information into categories. Like animals can include, for instance, reptiles, mammals, birds, etc. Right? The brain also prioritizes information. Some information, maybe because you like it more or you're more interested in, it takes priority. And might be organized differently and is easier to access. Okay, and control processes also allow us to direct mental operations, right? What is retrieved first, what you think of first, what comes to mind first. All that is due to the brain. It's often called the executive process, which we'll talk about more specifically in a moment. But the executive process, and executives is someone who makes decisions. And control processes affect the executive process, basically, where you're deciding how to organize information, how to prioritize it, how to direct it. The ability to use these control processes is called executive function. And we'll talk about that more specifically in a moment. And this improves with age and experience, your ability to organize information, to prioritize it, to direct it, right? It improves with age as the brain develops. Speed of processing is also important for information processing, right? This has to do with how quickly you can think, how quickly you can remember things, how quickly you can use information. Speed of processing continues to improve through middle childhood and even adolescence. And it's due to advances in myelination. Remember, myelin is that fatty tissue around the axon of neurons. Okay, there's an image of a neuron there at the bottom, at the lower right. The more myelin these neurons have, the more of them that are myelinated, the quicker these neurons can send those electrical signals to other neurons. Also, because of the development of dendrites become more dense. Remember, dendrites are those things that look like branches on neurons. that is more or less where the connections take place. They don't really touch each other, the neurons, but the dendrites are the one point of communication. And then the frontal cortex, specifically the prefrontal cortex. You see there the image of the brain on the upper right. That very front part specifically is important when it comes to speed of processing, because it has to do with making a plan and executing that plan. It deals with functions like that. Repetition is also going to improve the speed of processing. Repetition just simply means that you see the information over and over again, you rehearse it. Repetition makes neurons fire instantaneously. Okay, makes them fire quickly and in more coordinated ways, right? Allows for these pathways to be stimulated more quickly. So it's repetition will speed thinking. Okay, think about it this way. The more you read, the better you get at reading, and the faster you become at not just reading, but also comprehending the information. Same thing with doing math or any other task, right? With repetition, it gets easier, it gets faster. Repetition frees up capacity. When you first start doing something that you're not too good at, it takes a lot of takes up a lot of capacity, a lot of thought. It's like you're really focused on that and you can't think of other things. Like when you first start to read, right? You're trying so hard just to pronounce the letters correctly and pronounce the words correctly that you may not even understand what you're reading. But as you get better at it, you can read very fluently, very quickly, and you also understand what you're reading, and you can also be interrupted, and maybe they can ask you questions, and you have enough capacity, enough thinking left over that you can answer those questions, get back to where you were in the reading and understand what you're reading. Also, also improves memory, repetition. The more you repeat something, the more those pathways strengthen, and the easier it is to remember something. With repetition comes automatization. The more you do something over and over again, the more you repeat it, with time, it can become automatic, right? Automation requires practice, right? Repetition, and can take years to develop. It can take years to develop those reading skills, those comprehension skills, those math skills. So kids need to keep going to school year after year, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. However, here in the US, we get these long summer breaks, and kids, due to lack of repetition, due to lack of practice, can lose skills over the summer. And the teacher may have to basically go back and cover some of those things again to bring them up to where they're supposed to be for their grade level. But all that is affected by, affects speed of processing. Okay, let's keep going. Now, executive function. We mentioned it already when we talked about control processes. Executive function has to do with basically, like I said before, it has to do with control processes, the directing of information, the prioritizing, that kind of stuff. And there's different forms of executive function. Okay, there's what we call metacognition, which is a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking. You think about your own thinking, okay? Like for instance, when you have something to complete, a cognitive task, for instance, let's say you have to, learn a song or something like that, right? And you evaluate that task, right? How can I best learn this? How can I best accomplish it? So you're thinking about your own thinking, and you may adjust your strategy, okay? You monitor and adjust your performance on the task. It could be that you have to learn a list of words, okay? And you practice, right? You rehearse, you test yourself, and maybe you're lacking in some areas. So you adjust your strategies, and maybe I need to pay more attention to these words here in the middle, right? In the middle of the list. That's metacognition, thinking about thinking. You're thinking about your own memory, your own thinking, and that is part of executive function. That's metacognition. It improves with age and experience. As you get older, that gets easier to do, okay? Meta memory is just knowing about memory, which is also part of metacognition. Okay, I know that was kind of all abstract. We were thinking about thinking itself at that moment. We were involved in metacognition. We were talking about information processing. Okay, children do it at a lower level. They think about their own thoughts. They think about memory. They think about how they're going to work on something, that kind of stuff. Let's talk specifically about language development. It continues to improve, okay? Middle childhood is when children acquire what are called the pragmatics of language. Whenever you see the word pragmatic, that means it has to do with things that are practical. So things that are practical about language. So the pragmatics of language have to do with the practical application of language that involves things like tone of voice, right? Using a different tone of voice, for instance, to refer to different things. Okay, word choice. What word should you use when you talk about certain things, right? Grammar rules, definitions, context, it involves a lot of things. And here are some examples, like the use of metaphors, right? The use of certain words, that would be word choice. The use of certain words to convey meaning, right? Like a kid might say, walking on eggshells, right? He or she doesn't really mean that they're literally walking on eggshells, but it's a metaphor, right? It means that they have to be careful, they have to be quiet, or something like that, right? That has to do with word choice. Or they say, oh, I have egg on my face. It doesn't really literally mean they have egg on their face. It means that they feel embarrassed. Okay, last one is a rotten egg, a similar thing there, right? It's they're not really rotten eggs. They just mean they're the worst, right? The slowest, if they lose the race, for instance. That's to do with word choice. With tone of voice, it could be something like, saying something in a sad voice indicates that you're not happy, okay? Saying something in a happy voice means that you're pleased, okay? Word choice and metaphors go together, but word choice is also affected by, your audience, right? It's okay to call your friend a rotten egg, but not your parent. Your parent might get mad at you if you call them a rotten egg, okay? That's just a matter of word choice. How do you refer to certain people? And those, by the way, the words that you use to refer to your elders, your parents, stuff like that, those rules differ depending on the language. Like here in the US, it's okay to use the word you for your friends and parents. You tell your friend, you got in my way, right? You can tell your parent, you bought me this book, right? You can use you for both. But in other languages, not so much. Okay, in Spanish, you don't use the word you or tú with parents and with people your age. You use different words. You use words like usted, right? Just to give you an example of how things differ in other languages, because we are going to talk about other languages in a moment. Tone of voice, I mentioned already, but here's an example, right, of tone of voice. Maggie said in a sad voice, right? This is just what I wanted after receiving a pair of socks on her birthday from her uncle. Did Sally really like her gift? Oh, Sally, Maggie. Okay, I didn't keep the name consistent there. Right? Did Maggie really like her gift? No, her tone of voice reveals that she did not, but she doesn't want to, disappoint her uncle. She wants to basically pretend that she likes it, and she really doesn't. You can tell by the tone of voice. A 4-year-old would say yes, that Maggie did like the gift, right? Doesn't understand tone of voice. But older children will say no. They realize that there's a discrepancy between tone of voice and content, that there's a difference there between what they're saying and how they really feel. Okay, and all this are about the pragmatics of language, just using language in a practical way. It varies with audience, with tone of voice, the use of metaphors. All those are practical things about language that we learn with experience. Other things about language. What's the best way to learn how to read, for instance? There's the phonics approach, which everyone has probably heard of. And this is probably the way a lot of you learned language. This is when you learn the letters out of the alphabet, and then you learn the sounds of every letter. And then you learn to put those sounds together to make words, okay? To read words. And then you learn to read phrases and then sentences, right? That's the phonics approach. It works very well in languages where the sound letter combinations are clear. Like Italian and Spanish, right? There's certain letters, they all have their own sound. It's very clear, right? It does work in English as well, but not with all sounds, not with all letters. There are some letters that when you put them in certain words, they don't have a sound at all. We call these, silent letters, or like silent E or something like that. Or there might be, a silent, H, or maybe the TH sounds different than the T. and the H together. It's not always clear, okay, but there are the sound letter combination sometimes can vary in the English language. So you learn some of them through experience, right? Like there's just certain words, and I might have mentioned something like this before, like the word kernel, for instance. It's spelled nothing like the way it sounds. Why? Because it's a French word, okay? And it's not pronounced the way it's written. So the phonics approach can work well in certain languages, and it is used with the English language as well. It works for most words, but it doesn't work for some. Some you just have to learn that, okay, this is a different word. This one you have to memorize, okay? There's another approach to learning language, other than just figuring out the sounds and letters. It's called the whole language approach. Another way to learn reading, I should say, where the child is encouraged to use all their language skills, talking, listening, reading, and writing, right, in order to communicate. So you encourage children, right, to write and, on their own, invent their own spelling. Okay, you don't know how to write that, right? Just write it down however you think it's supposed to be. However you think it sounds, right? Just write it down. Oh, you don't know how to say that word, right? Just say it however you think it's said, right? And what happens is they say it and then they correct themselves, you correct them, and they kind of learn through experience. And I've seen this in kids, right? Kids write a little letter to mom. They say, Mom, we went to the mall and didn't know how to spell mall, spelled it M-O-L. Okay, that's wrong, but with experience, they'll learn, the right way to write it and even the right way to say it if they don't know how to say it. That's the whole language approach. They just use language and you'll figure it out through trial and error. That's kind of that approach. Phonics approach is very methodical, little step by step. Learn the letters, learn the sounds, put the sounds together. That makes words. This is how you, read it. This is how you write it. Okay. When it comes to language, vocabulary size, right? How many words you know? It's the best predictor of school achievement and overall intelligence, according to research, right? If your kid knows a lot of words, has a very big vocabulary, they'll probably do well in school, assuming that the language, of course, the vocabulary corresponds to the language, right? They'll do very well in school. And they'll also do better on those intelligence tests, which I believe we talked about, whether they actually measure intelligence or not. But language is a big predictor of a lot of things, of success in school, of doing well on not just intelligence tests, but tests in general, of doing well in college, right? The better you are at using the language, the better you're going to do. And low SES stands for socioeconomic status. So children who are lower on the economic scale, children who are poor, are exposed to less language. Why? Because it usually means their parents have menial jobs where that they don't require a lot of language. Their parents aren't lawyers or doctors or things like that. So their parents may be mechanics or maybe work at Walmart or as a cashier or something like that. And they don't have as much education as other parents, which means the parents don't have a really big vocabulary either. They don't expose their children to a lot of language because remember, parents talk to their children or they don't talk to them that much. And therefore the children are also lacking in language. But the child can develop very good language skills at school. And if parents do other things to supplement the child's education. Vocabulary size is important, and children, that come from poor households are already at a disadvantage because they don't hear a lot of language, or a lot of advanced language, I should say. There's a chart over here, or a table, whatever you want to call it, right? About where children are supposed to be at certain ages when it comes to reading. Like 4 to 5 years of age, they're supposed to understand basic concepts already. Like they should know that books are written from front to back. We read from left to right, that kind of stuff, right? They should be able to recognize the letters, right? Recognize and spell their own name. And keep in mind that some children may be behind, some children may be ahead, okay? 6 to 7 years of age, they should know the sounds of the consonants and the vowels. They should know the sounds of the letters, right? Including 2 sounds, like those that, like the TH, the th sound or whatever it is, right? They should be able to use sounds to figure out words, be able to figure them out on their own and be able to read simple words like cat, Okay. By 8 years of age, they should be able to read simple sentences. My son's going to be 8 soon. He's still at the previous level where he knows the sounds and can read some simple words. He's going to be a bit behind. He's on the autism spectrum. But by 8 years of age, they should be able to read simple sentences. They should be able to read about 50 words a minute. That's less than a word per second. So not very fast. Okay. They should be able to read words with 2 syllables. Word with 2 syllables, like person. Okay. For instance, not just cat, dog, right? They should understand basic punctuation, right? Where the period goes, to start with the sentence with a capital letter, things like that. They should know consonant vowel sounds. They should know blends, like the word blend, the BL, that's a blend, right? You have to blend certain letters, the sounds, right? To be able to read it correctly. And it's a little bit hard for children to learn that, but about 8 years of age, if they're average, they should know that. They should be able to comprehend what they read. They should understand what they read. Before this, they might be able to read, but it's so hard for them that they can't even tell you about what they're reading. They're just using all their effort just to figure out how to say it. 9 to 10 years of age, which is where my daughter is. She's going to be 10 years old soon, but she's way ahead of this because she's different, right? She's advanced. By 9 to 10 years of age, they should read and understand paragraphs and chapters. My daughter's reading books already, okay? Books that have hundreds of pages long. She loves to read. Okay, they should be able to answer comprehension questions about concepts, facts, right? Read polysyllabic words. They should know words like vegetarian, population, environment, right? They learn things like that, and they're learning things like that in school. Okay, 11 to 12 years of age, reading should be very rapid and fluent. Okay, they should be able to read more than 100 words per minute. It's almost like 2 words every second. Okay. They should know vocabulary that has a very specialized meaning, like the word environment. They should know what that means, or ecology, things that have to do with specific subjects, for instance. They should comprehend paragraphs, understand, when a whole paragraph when they're reading, be able to figure out the main idea, right? They should be able to sound out new words they haven't heard before. They should be able to sound them out and figure them out, and even use the context to figure out what the word means. And read for pleasure. My daughter reads for pleasure. She's been reading for pleasure for a long time now, for years, probably since she was 6, 7 years of age. 13 years of age, they should continue to build their vocabulary. Vocabulary gets stronger, right? There's more of an emphasis on comprehension, right? They should understand a lot more of what they read. Speech shouldn't really be an issue right now anymore. Them actually being able to read what's written, right? They should focus more on understanding what they're reading, right? And they should be able to understand textbooks. Look at their textbook, right? Whether it's English or whatever it is that they're using, these boring textbooks that they use in school, right? And should be able to understand by reading them. Let's keep going. Speaking of, language, reading and things like that, there are those, of course, who speak 2 languages, okay? Remember, we're a very diverse country, right? Lots of different types of people live in this country. Okay, and a lot of them speak 2 languages, or maybe even more. Before we talk about that, we need to talk about something related called code changes. Code changes are obvious when children speak one language at home and one at another. Different code, okay? It's like a different language, okay? But children can also use different codes even within the same language. Like, for instance, children can use a formal code at school, right? Like when they talk to their teachers, right? They talk in a certain way. Okay, and an informal code with their friends. When they're friends, they use other words. They use things that are informal, like calling somebody a rotten egg, for instance. It doesn't really mean rotten egg, right? But they wouldn't use that kind of language with their teacher or probably with their parents, right? The formal code with adults, the informal code with friends. It's like using a different language with different people. Okay, but we'll talk about specifically using 2 different languages soon. But here, of course, you can use a different code within the same language. Almost 1 out of every 4 U.S. school-aged children have a home language other than English. A lot of them speak a different language at home other than English, right? 1 in 20 will speak a different regional dialect. Okay, languages can also have different dialects, different forms of the language. All these alternate codes, alternate languages, you can think of them that way, just different ways of speaking, have distinct patterns of timing, right? How you say the words and how slow or fast you say them. The grammar, the rules differ depending on the language and the code, what you emphasize, what you don't emphasize, right? You know, you might think of that like an accent, the emphasis is on the E or something like that, or you emphasize something else, right? The S, you know, whatever it is, or, you know, different vocabulary, and requires more than literal translation, right? It's not just the literal translation. You have to understand what it really means, and often it doesn't translate very well to a different language. But let's talk more about this. Let's talk specifically about two languages, speaking two languages. And you can see the chart there, right? In the orange, the bar graph there, the orange shows you children who speak a language other than English at home, right? And you can see how that's been rising over the years, primarily because, you know, the Latino population has been growing, but it's not just Latinos, but it is mostly Latinos. And the purple bar, children who speak a language other than English at home and have difficulty speaking English. Out of those that do speak a second language at home, some of them have problems speaking English, right? And they require some type of remediation. So let's talk about, you know, these individuals. Let's talk about language learning first in general, okay? So language learning ability actually changes with age. Your ability to learn language and ability to learn a new language, right? Like for instance, like English, if that's not your home language, it changes with age, right? During infancy and early childhood, it's almost effortless, right? When you're a baby, you're a toddler, right? And you're being exposed to a certain language at home or let's say another country, whatever it is. As an immigrant, for instance, if you were fortunate enough to come to this country and be exposed to the English language very early on when you were still an infant, then you learn the English language very quickly without much effort through all that exposure. In middle childhood, it takes some work, right? By the time you're 6 to 11 years of age, it's going to be a bit harder. Your brain is already wired kind of for another language. It's going to take more effort, but it's not as hard as when you're an adult. When you're an adult, it's even harder to learn language. Okay, your brain is already fully developed, and it's just harder, right, to change the way your brain functions. And that's, there are some of that is required when you learn a new language. It's just a different way of thinking to some extent. English language learners are those individuals in the US with low English proficiency. Most likely, they probably speak another language other than English at home, okay? And they have trouble with the English language. Okay, they're not that good at it, and they need to learn it, right? They need to get better at it. What's the best way, to teach them English? Okay, a couple of approaches here. We'll talk about a couple. Actually, a few more than this, but there's total immersion. Total immersion is where they're only instructed in the second language. So it's like basically, okay, you're only gonna, get your education's only gonna be in English, right? It's like your teacher, she doesn't speak Spanish, okay, for instance, and she's just gonna speak English to you, and you're just gonna have to learn it. Okay, and immersion is basically it involves immersing yourself or basically being a part of the culture. So you go to school and you hear nothing but English there from the teacher, from your friends, right? You watch TV in English, you listen to music in English, and you immerse yourself in the language. And through that great exposure, you will learn the language. And it works, right? You can do that with French as well, with German. Best way to learn French, go live in France for a while. Now you'll pick up the language after a few years. You'll become fluent. Same thing, go in other countries, right? Here in the US, right, you want to learn English really well, you have to immerse yourself in the language, right? English music, English TV, English at school, friends speak English, and you just have to learn it. And you will through exposure. It's not as successful after puberty because children feel shy, stupid, socially isolated, right? When they're not that good at it, they feel kind of shy and stupid, and they may not try, or they may isolate themselves and may not want to speak up. Or maybe they just want to continue looking at things that have to do with, music and books and stuff like that have to do with their native language because they feel stupid and they can't understand the English language. It works early, it works better early on. Okay. That's the way it is. It's just harder to learn language after puberty, but it's just total immersion, right? Read in English, speak in English, TV in English, music in English, everything in English. And after a while, you'll get it. Same thing with France or German or whatever you want to learn, okay? Reverse immersion is the opposite, where first they teach you in your native language, right? You don't know how to speak English, and your first language, let's say, is Spanish. Okay, well, we're going to teach you in Spanish, all right? You're going to have your education in Spanish for several years. Your math is going to be in Spanish, your science, right? Your reading, all that stuff's going to be in Spanish. And then when your language skills get a bit more advanced, then you'll be taught English as a foreign language, okay? This is not as successful when it's used to teach English-speaking Americans a second language. Doesn't work so well with Americans, okay, whose only language, let's say it's English, and they want to learn a second language, and they do it through reverse immersion. It's not as successful than, let's say, immersion, but it is also used for those who don't speak English, for instance, who only speak Spanish, and they learn Spanish at first, and then they introduce English gradually later on as they progress through the grade levels. And parents often complain and say, hey, what the hell's going on here? My kid that doesn't know how to speak English. What are you guys teaching them, right? It's reverse immersion. They'll learn those skills later when they're ready for them. And when the language is introduced later on, they'll pick it up more quickly because they already know some rules about language. Other approaches, bilingual education, is where subjects are taught in the native language and the second language, right? You use both languages and you translate, and that's bilingual education, okay? English as a second language, which is what I saw when I was in high school. I remember there were ESL classes. I was not in them, of course, because yes, I am an immigrant. I came to this country a long time ago, and I came here as a child, like as a 6-year-old child. And I picked up the language very quickly. I was not an infant. I would have been better, right? But I was still pretty young, and I picked it up very fast. In about a year, I was fluent. No way was I in ESL in high school, but there were other kids who were more recent immigrants who were. And ESL is basically intensive study of basic English in a separate class until they're ready to be educated in an English-only class. So they put them in these classes, these ESL classes, where they learn basic English, and it's like you're teaching them English like they're in elementary school or something. And you're teaching the sounds and the sound letter combinations, and hopefully they get better and better until one day they're good enough that they can go in the regular English class and actually pass. But if you put them in a regular English class and they could barely speak English, they're going to fail. So they have these ESL classes to help out those students. That's language. Social factors that affect the language gap. Social factors in the language gap. Okay, so some children are just better at language than others. Okay, they're more advanced, they do better on the tests, they have better English skills, right? What are things that affect this difference that we see, that gap, okay? Well, one of them is socioeconomic status. Like I said, those in low SES families, those that come from poor households, even if they speak English, are gonna be exposed to less language. They're gonna have smaller vocabularies. They're gonna hear more simple vocabularies, shorter sentences. If your parents are not highly educated, they speak differently. And that's the kind of language that the children are exposed to. And those children, even if it's English that they hear at home and not a second language, right? Even if it's that, they're going to do worse in school. They're going to do worse on those tests because their vocabularies are not that advanced. Their parents are like working class or lower class, whatever it is, and they don't hear a lot of complex language. You hear language like, hey, Junior, hey, give me that thing over there. That thing, what thing, right? They don't even know what the thing's called often, or they can't think of it, right? Even in Spanish, they say things like that. Hey, tráeme esa cosa ahí, esa cosa güey. Things like that. It's like, that's not proper language, right? But if your parents are educated, right? If they're lawyers, doctors, you're going to hear very different language. And you'll develop these, a better vocabulary. You'll hear more complex language. You'll be better at language, right? Where a doctor is more likely to say something like, get that repulsive reptile away from me. The word repulsive, right? Children can learn that at a very early age. They've heard it from the beginning. Especially, by the way, if your children are British, if they're English, for instance, like you should they talk, right? It's their language, the English language. and they're very good at it. And children are exposed to this, college level vocabulary, as infants, in middle childhood. It's amazing. You should hear the way they talk, right? But here in the US, we kind of have a bastardized form of English, believe it or not, a dumbed down version of English, not like the British, not like the English people, okay? But if you're poor, lower class, working class, even worse, if your parents are educated, right? Lawyers, doctors, scientists, whatever it is, they know a lot more language and their kids are exposed to a lot more language, and then their kids would be better off because of that. My daughter and my son, to some extent, though he's on the autism spectrum, especially my daughter, is benefiting a lot by the fact that she has two educated parents. But our parents were very uneducated. My mother had a third-grade education. What kind of language you think we heard at home, even though it was in Spanish, right? Yeah, we were behind early on, but eventually we caught up and we did well. Correlations also matter. Hippocampus development, we talked about the hippocampus before. That has to do with, for instance, getting things into memory, helps with the storage of memory. The more that part of the brain is developed, the easier it is for you to learn language and learn new words, right? But also other things like, inadequate prenatal care. Inadequate prenatal care, for instance, not taking care of yourself as a mother very well, right? When you're pregnant, if you, for instance, use drugs or you don't get proper nutrition, you're exposed to certain teratogens, that will affect the development of the brain, especially the development of the hippocampus. Children not, getting breakfast, for instance. There are, children who just don't get breakfast and they just have to, the parents have to go to work early in the morning and they have to rush them off to school, and often they don't even get to eat in the morning. Their brains are less ready to learn because they're not nourished, right? Those exposed to lead, we talked about that, plumbism, right? How it's toxic to the brain and leads to lower intelligence and more aggressive behavior. Crowded housing, right? Stressful neighborhoods, neighborhood violence, all that affects the development of the brain. Those are all studies that tell us about the correlations among the hippocampus and all those other things that affect the development of the hippocampus. Beyond correlations, the home language I talked about already, has to do also with economics, right? The mother's education. Mothers are the ones that talk most to their children. They're the ones who do most of the child rearing, so to speak. The mother's education matters more than the father's education. If the mother has a good education, the children will be better off, even if the father doesn't have much of an education. Now, if it's the father, the one that has the higher education, the mother has a low education, then in that case, the children will still be exposed to less language because usually fathers are not that involved. It's the mother that's more involved. So the mother's education matters more. Other things that matter, expectations, adult positive expectations, right? Do you believe in your children? You believe they're smart. You believe they can achieve, right? What about those teacher expectations, right? Does the teacher believe that the child can learn, or the teacher think your child's a dumbass, right? That's very bad if they think that. There are stereotypes, okay? And I don't have to tell you what stereotypes those are. The stereotypes about minority children and their intelligence and their ability to learn. And a lot of teachers also believe these stereotypes and may not believe that their child is capable. And that's a very bad thing. Sharing the same expectations as your teacher. If the parent has high expectations, so as the teacher, that is good. But if also the teacher's attitudes, right? The teacher believing that your child is smart and can learn, right? Believing that all children can learn, they just need, good educators, right? Teacher being nice and warm, right? And caring, right? The teacher's skill matters a lot too. Some teachers are just better able to teach than others. All that matters for education. And we see this language gap, right? Among not just children whose first language is not English, but also children who are poor and minority children. Why? Because of all these things. But education also matters. When you're poor, you go to, schools in poor neighborhoods, where teachers often are, well, not the best teachers, right? And I'm not saying that you can't have good teachers. You often do. But guess what? The richer neighborhoods, the better neighborhoods, so to speak, that are richer, they have better schools, more supplies, more money. They pay teachers better. And teachers compete to teach in those places. And they end up with the better teachers on average. You should see who's educating the rich kids. You should see how advanced those teachers are and how good they are. And compare them to what we have here. I'm not saying you can't have good teachers, because you did, some of them, but most of them were kind of average and some of them were even bad. What about numbers? Okay, where should your child be as far as their numbers, their math ability? Okay, at a given age, 4 to 5 years of age, they should be able to count to 20 already. Do you understand the meaning of more or less, right? This one's more, this one's less, and what that means. Understand one-to-one correspondence of objects. This is 2 blocks and it's represented by the number 2. 2 means that there's this many, right? So they should understand the correspondence of objects and numbers, right? They should recognize and be able to name the shapes. This is a triangle, this is a square, right? Has this many sides, you know, that kind of stuff. By 6 years of age, they should be able to count to 100. My son's going to be 8. He can't count to 100 yet. He's on the autism spectrum, right? By 6, they should be able to count to 100. They should understand what is bigger, what is smaller, right? They should be able to add and subtract 1-digit numbers. That's what my son is learning right now, and it's really frustrating trying to teach him that stuff. He understands numbers. He understands, you know, he can say the numbers. He understands, you know, what they mean. He can count, right? Adding, subtracting, it's like he could only do it with very small numbers, okay? And it's frustrating to try to teach him, you know, to add things that add up to 20 something or 13 or something like that. But we're trying, okay? We're trying to help him because we're doing the job of teachers now. When we have these remote lessons via Zoom, guess what? The teacher's teaching via Zoom and the parent has to be there, or somebody, you know, like a babysitter. We also had to hire a babysitter to help my son, right? Help the kids, you know, understand what it is the teacher's trying to tell them and help them do the work. My daughter, she's way advanced. She can do it all on her own. She's off, you know, in her remote learning, and she's doing it on her own. She's fine. But my son, special ed, autism spectrum, he needs a lot of help, okay? By 8 years of age, you should be able to add and subtract 2-digit numbers, okay? They should understand simple multiplication and division. Use word problems with 2 variables, okay? Word problems are hard, right? But they should understand that by 8 years of age, some simple word problems with 2 variables. By 10 years, should be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide multi-digit numbers, right? 3 digits, 4 digits, 5 digits, right? You know, as many as you give them, they should know the rules and how it works. There are simple rules that, you know, tell us how to do that. They should understand simple fractions, a half, a third, a fourth. What is that? Do they know what it means? You show them a picture, right, of an orange. This one's half, this one's quarters, right? They should understand stuff like that. Percentages, right? Area, the perimeter of shapes, right? How long they are around, right? Understand word problems with 3 variables. By 12 years of age, you should be able to use abstract concepts, right? Such as formulas and, you know, basic algebra, X and Y and stuff, and X equals this and whatever, you know, by 12 years of age. I will tell you, though, that we are not very good at teaching math in this country. And there's a very good reason for that, okay? Because if you're good at math, we're not very good at math and science in this country in general, but if you're very good at math and science, let's say, you're probably not going to end up being a teacher. You're going to go work for some corporation, you know, or somewhere else where they're going to pay you a lot more money than the teacher, okay? So as far as our math teacher, we get the ones that are kind of average, so-so, you know, and we don't have the best teachers when it comes to math. You want to get really good math teachers? Pay them like they're, you know, increase the pay, like the level of scientists or the level of those people working in technology. Those people are good at math, right? And what will happen then is that, you know, you'll have more candidates and only the best ones will be able to be math teachers. And a lot of them that would have been otherwise math teachers won't make it anymore, okay? But we end up with, you know, the people at the bottom. Because if you're good at math and science, you're not going to end up being a teacher, okay? There's better job opportunities. So that's what happens, right? So we're not very good at math in this country. We're behind, and you'll see why, and you'll see in a moment where we stand relative to other countries. Those are the last things we're going to talk about. Let me make sure I check the time here, make sure we're not going too slow, make sure I finish this up. We're okay on time. Schooling in the United States. Let's talk about schooling in the United States because I'm kind of getting to that already. There has been improvement in academic performance over the past decades. We have been getting better, okay? Yes, education has gotten better despite our complaints about it, right? Complaints about, you know, that, you know, education in the US sucks, right? We're not very good and stuff like that. It has been getting better. It used to be a lot worse, okay? We thought we were okay, but when we compare ourselves to other countries, we realize that we're not that good, right? But we have this mentality, hey, we're US, we're #1, right? No, we're not. And a lot of things we're not when it comes to academics. And you'll see in a moment, you'll see what the tests, the international tests show us, right? There are gaps also between income and ethnic groups, right? Lower income groups score lower. Other ethnic groups like minorities are often behind as well, especially if English is not their first language, or because of other things like stereotypes and discrimination and racism, right? All that affects learning. Schools now are more segregated than 4 decades ago. They're more segregated, right? You know, you got white people living over here, mostly in the nice communities, better education, better schools, and you got the Latino and Black kids over here in the worse schools, or with the more violent neighborhoods, right? The poorer schools, right? You do have, you know, white kids that are also poor, you know, as well, yeah. But there's the average, you know, child, you know, comes usually from a family that's much better off economically, on average, than, let's say, Blacks and Latinos. Asians, on the other hand, are an exception. Asians are actually really believe in education, and they're more likely to do better, and their parents are more likely to be educated and have decent jobs. So Asian people actually are doing just as well as whites, or even better in things like math and science. Their culture is different. Okay. And I don't remember if we talked about why already, but you know, there are cultural differences. But yeah, schools are very segregated. Yeah, you got the Black people over here, the Latinos over here, the Asians over there, the white people over there. And when there's segregation, there's discrimination, there's racism, right? There's inequality. That's what happens. But people segregate themselves is what happens. Other things have to do with schooling in the US. To address these gaps, these problems, the fact that some groups are behind, right? They've tried to put in what they call these Common Core standards. I think this is part of that whole No Child Left Behind thing. But the Common Core standards were basically a set of standards, very rigorous, you know, with high expectations, right? Specific expectations for achievement in each subject, for each grade, right? That children should be able to do this by this grade level. They should know this, and they should be able to, you know, to do this, right? In English and math or whatever it is. These standards, these expectations, they were adopted by, you know, 44 states in 2013. Some states opted out, but if your state opted out, it means that you didn't get federal funds, okay? So most states opted in for that, okay? So these standards, right? It basically led to a lot of what we call standardized testing about what your child's supposed to know and how they're supposed to do, right? Initially, you know, teachers favored it, right? But then opposition grew as the testing was implemented, and they realized that it had a lot to do with standardized testing, and standardized testing is awful, okay, and boring, and often doesn't even correspond to what the kids are learning. Only about 12% of teachers opposed it in 2013, right? Most teachers were okay with it. Sounds like a good idea. Yeah, the kids should know this by this grade, and you know, they should be able to do this, right? And we need to teach these specific skills, right? And then they realized that it had a lot to do with standardized testing and a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Taking the same approach to every child, and you know, in every school and stuff like that. And there's a lot of variation in children. You shouldn't all teach them the same way, right? 40% of teachers opposed it by 2014, and I'm pretty sure that has grown by now. Okay, a lot of people are opposed to it now, right? This standardized testing, one-size-fits-all education. We're not all the same, and we shouldn't all be taught the same way. And it's just, it's not good when you standardize education. Okay, we're not robots. Okay, the same approaches don't work for all children. Some children are ahead, some children are behind. And well, there's a lot of variation. And when you standardize everything, it leads to problems. Other things, there's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, if you've heard about this, right? This is like basically a way of thinking about it. This is like the nation's report card, how we're doing as a country, right? It's an ongoing and nationally representative measure of US children's achievement in reading, math, and other subjects over time. So it's basically, how are we doing in reading? How are we doing in math, in science, right? As a whole, as a nation. It's like, okay, the whole country gets a certain grade. We're getting an A, we're doing really well, we're getting a B. We're not doing well, okay? There's a lot of gaps, a lot of children are behind. Our education in the US, not that good. And it's because we don't value teachers that much, believe it or not. Okay, it's and another thing, and there's all kinds of problems that we'll mention in a moment as well. all kinds of controversies. Achievement is influenced by income and ethnicity with a widening gap. Like I said, there's a lot of segregation, a lot of inequality, there's discrimination, there's racism, there's all these problems, okay? And poverty, all those things, right, are gonna affect education. And I think I said this before, but school funding has a lot to do with where you live. If you live in a nice, rich neighborhood, right, it means the homes are worth a lot, and those property taxes are used for the schools in that neighborhood. So they have more, they get more money. In a poor neighborhoods, properties are not worth that much. You know, less property tax, less funding for the schools in that neighborhood. If you ask me, I think they should take all the funding from all the properties in the state and divide them equally among schools. That's what it is. It's public education, right? Schools should receive the same, you know, the same income per child, no matter what school it is. But of course, that would get a lot of people angry and say, no, why should we give you some of our money when we, you know, this is for our neighborhood, right? This is from our property taxes, right? There's a certain proposition that has to do with that. I don't remember what proposition it is. It was passed a long time ago here in California. And it basically allowed for, you know, these inequalities, what I consider discrimination just based on income, okay? Public education is public education, okay? Your school shouldn't get less money just because it's in a, you know, less affluent neighborhood. Okay, it just that proposition just guaranteed that the rich neighborhoods are always going to have more money, and they're always going to basically be able to pay their teachers better and attract greater talent than the poor neighborhoods. It's discrimination, right? At a structural level, at a government level, okay, at a society level. Other controversial issues: public education and public funding priorities. I mentioned that, right? The laws and rules that have to do with allocating funding, right? There's a lot of money for education. A lot of money is used for education. The problem is that it's not used equitably. It's most of, you know, more, like I said, the richer neighborhoods, the schools in the richer neighborhoods get more money because of property taxes. And it should not be that way, right? We should have one pot of money and divide it evenly among schools. Of course, schools that are smaller should get less money, right? It should be a certain amount per pupil, right? Per pupil spending, right? But some schools get a lot of money per pupil and some very little. It just depends on the neighborhood, okay? Vouchers, right? Should children, you know, should parents be able to use vouchers for their kids, right? Where they can send their kids to a different school, like maybe a charter school, right? But then when you do that, you're taking away money from public schools. And the ones in the poor neighborhoods already don't have a lot of money. They're already suffering. What about homeschooling? Maybe you should homeschool your kids, because public education, for the most part, is not that good. It's awful, to tell you the truth, okay? Especially if you're come from a poor neighborhood. Maybe you want to homeschool your kids, but you have to think about it, right? Are you really going to do a good job with that? Are you educated as a parent? Can you homeschool them? Do you even have a college education, right? If you don't, your child's probably better off at you know, in regular school, right? But if you're a highly educated parent and you have the time, you can probably do a better job than the schools are doing. I can do a better job. Me and my wife can do a better job, right? Because we're highly educated. The problem is we don't have the time. We have jobs, right? We don't have the time. So our kids go to school, yeah, and they go to public school, okay? Public education and freedom of religion, yeah, you know, freedom of religion, right? Teaching and affects science, the teaching of science in school, right? There's controversy about that. And, you know, if there's certain schools, right, where they don't want certain things taught about science and they prefer other things to be taught, but those are not science. There's controversy about that. The arts, right? Should we fund the arts? Should there be art classes and music classes and things like that? Well, there's not a lot of money, so we have to cut those classes in poor neighborhoods. Second language in primary school, right? What about those that speak a second language, right? How do you educate them? We've talked about those. Computers, right? Technology in the classroom. It's a problem. Technology is expensive. And guess which schools are gonna get better technology? Those that get more money. When I was in, you know, in public school, but they didn't even have computers in the classroom. Now they have computers in the classroom, right? But in the poor neighborhoods, they don't have a computer for every child. Okay, they have a couple of computers. And they have to share, and you have to put the kids in group, and you have to rotate them. Whereas in the richer schools, all the kids get a laptop basically, or they actually tell the parents, "Hey, you have to buy a laptop for your kids," and the parents can afford it because they're wealthy. All right. and they have fast internet and good internet. You should see the internet at some of these schools and the computers and how old they are, right? But yeah, nowadays, if you're not using technology for learning, you're not prepared for the real world. And by the way, I'm going to point something out. You using your smartphones, right? Your tablets, that's not the same thing. A lot of students are good at using their smartphone, their tablets, and they can't write a paper because they're using their smartphone and their tablet. That's not the same thing as having a computer. It is a computer, but it doesn't do all the things that a computer can do. And there's a lot of students that actually don't know how to use a computer very well because they just rely on their smartphone. But that's all they have. That's all they can do. At least they have something. Okay, but it's not the same thing as being able to use a computer that can do all the different things. Okay, class sizes matter. Guess what? Poor neighborhoods, 40 to 1, right? One teacher for like 40 students. Other schools, richer neighborhoods, might be 20 to 1 or even less. Okay, they tried to do away with that for a while when there was more money for education. Before the 2008 recession, they actually made class sizes smaller because research shows that when class sizes are smaller, the teacher has more time for every student, the students do better. So they actually basically, changed it so to have smaller classrooms, at least in elementary school. And they had 20 to 1. I remember that. I wasn't in school during that time, but I do remember because I did teach 3rd grade in the 1990s. Before I went to graduate school, I taught for a year. I taught 3rd grade after getting my bachelor's. And I remember these small class sizes. And then the recession happened in 2008. By the way, I was long gone by then. I was already, past graduate school and already teaching over here. But there was a recession. And then they say, well, we can't afford these small sizes anymore. We have to cram more students per class. We have to fire some teachers, right? They went back to the big class sizes. And when the economy improved, as it did, right, they never went back. And they probably never will now, okay? The role of soft skills in education and curriculum. Those soft skills, there's just other things that students have to learn other than just the academics, okay? But, we have to move on to other things before we run out of time. Let's talk, we've been talking about education a lot and about, education in the US not being that good, right? Well, how is it in other countries and how do we compare? In order to know that, we have to know about international testing. Over the past 2 decades, more than 50 nations, more than 50 countries, right, have participated in at least one massive international test of educational achievement, okay? And there's different forms of international testing. So these international tests, achievement test scores, right, come in different forms. There's the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. There's the PEARLS, right, which tests how well you can read, how good you are at language, basically. There's Trends in Math and Science, right? That's called the TIMSS, right? The TIMSS. And those are the important ones, right? So how good are you at language? How good are you at math and science? Here are some results for you guys. And this results only go up to, let's see, 2018, okay? They are recent. But you can see at the top there, we have Singapore. Singapore is an Asian country. Like I told you guys, Asian people in general, they have a different culture. And you know what? They stress academics. They stress working hard, and they believe that you can become more intelligent if you work hard, right? And you know what? In general, I'll tell you this, Asian people are kicking ass, okay? Here in the US, they're even outperforming white people and even other Asian countries. They're doing better overall. And Singapore is one example. Finland is also doing very well, has improved recently, right? They're there near the top, right? The average is in the gray, and you can see the US, well, we're a little bit less than average in math, and we're about average in reading and science. Hey, what the heck happened there, right? We're the richest country in the world. What happened to we're number one? Guess what? We're not, okay? Not when it comes to academics. We should be number one. We're the richest country in the world. We should be doing better than this. We should be, way at the top, but we're not. Okay, we believe that, by the way, we believe we're number one, and that's part of the whole belief, right? That, as Americans, we're number one, we're the best, and well, the testing, at least in academics, doesn't really show it. Okay, we probably have, we have the richest economy, right? We're definitely the richest country, and by the way, that's not going to stay that way. Eventually, China is going to surpass us. It's just a matter of time. Okay, these countries that are doing better, education, better job of educating their students, right? Guess what? They're going to get better. Education leads to advancements. It leads to better business. It leads to more opportunities. And it's only a matter of time. I don't know how long. It might be 10 years, might be 20 years. It's only a matter of time before China is doing a lot better than us, even economically. That is what is happening. China is rising very quickly. And so are the other Asian countries. I mean, Japan and all. The Asian countries in general are doing very well. They have a very different culture. And they don't always have democracy, by the way. I'm not saying democracy is bad, but China doesn't have democracy. They're communists. But they have very smart leaders. Despite the fact that, they don't really have, as many freedoms as we do here. Dominican Republic is at, near the bottom. Okay, that's a very poor country. You'd expect them to be at the bottom, near the bottom. It's a very poor country. But as the US, we should be doing better. And people complain about this. Hey, why aren't we doing better? We have been getting better, but, well, not much better. Some other facts about this stuff. For the pearls, that's the one that's to do with reading, language, right? Girls ahead of boys in verbal skills in almost every nation. In almost every country, we find the same pattern that basically females are better at language than boys. Girls are better at language than boys. There might be some biological differences that are. We find that in almost every nation as well, these patterns, right? I misspelled the TIMS there. That's supposed to be an extra I there. But the TIMS, there's gender differences, right? Have narrowed in math and science, right? Women are catching up to males in math and in science. And I'll tell you, if I haven't told you guys this already, but females are the ones who are more likely to go to college now and more likely to go to graduate school and are getting the majority of advanced degrees now, more so than males. Even at our college, right? Close to 60% females, and males are more like at 40%. There's more women going to school and going to college and getting more degrees than males nowadays. And in the future, we're going to have the opposite trend that we have now. We're going to have more women who are highly educated than males. And those differences that we see in the testing will probably narrow, and we might find that women are doing better in the future than males because we see that where the trends are going. In the classrooms, girls get higher grades overall, but they dip at puberty. Once puberty hits, there is a dip in motivation and in grades. And we talked about reasons for that, starting a new school, right? Puberty and the challenges with that. But girls tend to have better grades overall. Males are more likely to mess around and not be motivated and not try hard, even when they are intelligent. And that starts like at puberty, where they start acting like dumbasses, basically. A lot of people do that. I remember plenty of kids I went to school with. They were very smart in grade school, right? And all of a sudden, we get to like junior high, high school, puberty, and now they just want to be cool, right? And now they're getting D's and F's. Like, what the hell, man? You're capable of getting A's. But it happens a lot, especially in the poor neighborhoods, because in the poor neighborhoods, you know what we think is cool? We think that the drug addicts are the ones that are cool, right? The ones that use drugs, the people who just want to party, the jocks, oh, they're the cool ones, right? And people want to be like them. You know who should be cool? The smart kids. That's who should be cool. And when you go to a good school, that's not a dysfunctional school, the smart kids actually are popular, but we are dysfunctional in these poor neighborhoods. We have problems that other schools don't necessarily have, or not to that extent. What do these rank? Because in those other schools, the ones that are using drugs and the ones that are, that just want to party and hang out, those are the ones who are actually looked down on. Like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, why the hell don't you take school seriously? Flunking all your classes, trust me, right? They're the ones who are not. They're not the ones who are popular. But in the poor neighborhoods, we think the ones that are dysfunctional are the ones that are popular. And that's not right. What do these rankings reveal? Okay, when we look at this international testing, they reveal, national and cultural context affects these test scores. Okay, the U.S. Ranking has risen over the past 2 decades. We have gotten a little bit better, but in 2015 there were 19 nations, 19 countries that were doing better than the U.S. At least when they just look at the 4th grade. There's a lot of other countries doing better than us, and we're richer than those countries. Most developing nations do not even give tests. The ones that are poor, they don't even give these tests. So the fact that the Dominican Republic did that was kind of different to begin with. And you can see they didn't do very well. They're a very poor country. Usually those poor countries don't even have the funds to even participate, okay? When they do participate, their scores are low, as we saw. Finland's educational reforms resulted in dramatic ranking increases in 2011. Finland has gotten a lot better recently. Why? Because they made some reforms in education. They changed some things when it comes to their education. They pay teachers better. They have higher qualifications. They teach things differently. And by the way, it also helps the fact that they're kind of a rich country and they don't have a big population. That also helps, by the way. In the US, we're a very rich country, but we have a huge population, okay? And Finland has certain advantages that we can't have. But in Finland, they also treat their teachers differently. They pay them better. You know, they pay them like real professionals, like doctors and lawyers. If you pay teachers like that over here, you would attract the best teachers, right? Not everyone would be qualified to be a teacher, but I'll tell you what it takes to be a teacher. All you have to do is get a BA in something and you're qualified to be a teacher. You don't have to be that good. You just got that degree. Maybe you got all C's. Maybe you barely made it. You can be a teacher, right? Not maybe at the good neighborhoods, but yeah, you're good enough for the poor neighborhoods. There's usually always a need for teachers, okay? Some teachers even quit. The hell with this. They don't pay me enough, you know, for what I do, right? And those that have other opportunities will usually take them. That is where we'll stop. That's the last slide. Let me stop recording.